May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Well, friends, it has been a week since Jesus was raised, but in today's gospel reading, we are taken back to Easter Day, still trying to figure out what happened. It is by now late on Easter Sunday afternoon, and we find ourselves on a long walk with a couple of Jesus' disciples. Nobody from the inner circle, just two people on the margins of the Jesus movement. One named Cleopas, and the other one, well, we don't know because Luke doesn't bother to say what the other one's name is. All the people who had poured into Jerusalem to observe the Passover are now dispersing. They're headed back to their own towns and villages all over the Judean countryside. Cleopas and his friends are on the road to Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They weren't alone. The roads would have been full of people returning home after the Passover festival, headed back to life and work and 1,000 distractions and joys and sorrows. As they walked along, Cleopas and his friend kept going over and over the strange, unsettling events of the past week, talking it through, turning it over, going over the same territory again and again to see if some new angle would reveal itself. If they could just find the key to unlock the mystery, maybe all of this would make sense. A stranger came near them who looked like he could use some walking companions. "What are you discussing?" he asked. And he saw how sad they looked, agitated and downcast and overwrought. To cope with their grief, they began to tell the story again, this time to the stranger who was walking with them. They told him about this rabbi, Jesus, who was a prophet and a healer. They told about how Jesus helped them understand that their lives had value, even though they were only laborers, fishermen and carpenters, toiling away to scratch out a simple existence in a brutal world. They told how Jesus was always talking about going into Jerusalem to confront the powers that be, and how this past week at Passover, he had finally done that. Jesus had led the crowds right into the temple courtyard itself, and he'd kicked out the money changers and the merchants selling sacrificial doves and lambs. It had caused quite a scene. And then day after day, he had taught the crowds that gathered in the temple, and how he had faced off with the priests and the Pharisees, pushing them to rethink their old interpretations of the scriptures. Cleopas and his friend then got to the hardest part of the story. Eventually, the priests got fed up. There was a lot of unrest in the city. The Romans had noticed this Jesus, and they were cracking down. They didn't want any trouble. Things were getting uncomfortable enough for one in the inner circle of Jesus' disciples to go to the priests and to try to broker some kind of deal. Or maybe Judas was just in it for the money. Who knows? The end result was that Jesus was arrested late on Thursday night. They told the stranger how Jesus was tried first by the priests and then by Rome. Roman justice was swift and brutal. By Friday afternoon, it was all over. They crucified Jesus, along with a couple of other troublemakers. And then Joseph of Arimathea had taken the body and laid it in his own tomb. But the strangest part of all was what had happened that very morning. The women had gone to the tomb early Sunday morning to take care of the body, and they found it empty. They said they had a vision, angels, telling them that Jesus was still alive, but maybe that was just wishful thinking. The tomb was empty, but Cleopas and his friend did not know what to make of it. Their walking companion took in this strange story, and then he began to teach them. Turns out he knew the scriptures pretty well. And he showed them how what had happened might have been predicted by Moses and the prophets. This might be what would happen to a Messiah, if a Messiah ever showed up. This disturbing ending to the story might actually confirm that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah that Scriptures had talked about. By this time, they made it to Emmaus, and even though it seemed like the stranger wanted to keep walking, they urged him to stay with them. It was late. It was time for the evening meal. So they came into the house and prepared the meal, and this part was quite unusual. The stranger sat at the head of the table, and he started acting like the host. And they let him. It just seemed like the right thing to do. And he took bread and broke it, blessed it, and gave it to them. And in that moment, suddenly, their eyes were open, and they saw Jesus. Maybe they really saw him for the first time. And then he was gone from their sight. Except, of course, he wasn't gone, because he was there with them in the breaking of the bread. And they knew in their hearts that he would always be there with them like that in the breaking of the bread from now on. And so, friends, he is here with us to this day when we come together as a community. Every time we gather and break bread at this table, Jesus is here with us. Friends, this account of that long Easter afternoon is remarkable and beautiful, and I could stop right here because the story itself is rich and full. What more else is there to say? But I do want to peel back the layers of the story just a bit, because I think if you dig into how Luke has constructed this story and what he's trying to do by telling it in this way, it begins to mean even more. And I should acknowledge here that my understanding of this story relies a lot on theologian John Dominic Crossan's book called The Power of Parable. According to Crossan, this story of one afternoon on the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus is really the story of everything that happened in the first 50 or 60 years of Christian history. Luke has taken everything from the moment of Jesus' resurrection right up until the moment when Luke is writing the story down, which was 50 or 60 years later. And he has condensed all of the developments of those decades into one parabolic afternoon. Like Cleopas and his friend on the road, Jesus' followers were demoralized after the events of that Passover week, and they did disperse back to where they came from. And then they kept telling this story about Jesus over and over and over, looking for some new angle, a new insight for understanding and hope. They told the story, no doubt, on that first Easter afternoon, but then they kept telling it again and again, over years, over decades. And they did meet strangers along the way, and they shared the story with these newcomers. They became witnesses of everything that Jesus said and did. And when they sat down to share a meal, they remembered what Jesus had done at their Last Supper together. Now, I'm quoting from Jesus' gospel here in chapter 22 at the Last Supper. When the hour came, he took his place at the table, and the apostles with him. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." That was on Thursday night. On Sunday afternoon, in the story that we just heard, here is what happened. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened. Take, bless, break, give. This is what Jesus always did. This is how they learned to remember him. By the time Luke is writing this story down 50 or 60 years later, they knew that they could rely on these ritual actions to bring them into God's presence. In fact, Luke uses this ritual action to frame his whole gospel. Jesus' Last Supper in chapter 22 is the centerpiece of a Eucharistic triptych that begins with the feeding of the 5,000 that happens in Luke chapter 9 and ends with that meal at Emmaus in chapter 24. Here's what happens in chapter 9, just at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke them and gave them to the disciples to set before the crowd. And all ate and were filled. Take, bless, break, give. Be known to us in the breaking of bread. Friends, we are all together on the road to Emmaus today. All of us are walking along, and some of us are sad, overwrought, carrying heavy burdens. There are wars and rumors of wars. There are too many people around us who are suffering, unsheltered, and in pain. But I believe that Jesus is walking on this road with us. Now, we might not recognize him at first, but the life of a Christian, of a Jesus follower, is learning how to open our eyes, to welcome the stranger, and remember Jesus through the simple, ordinary blessings of our lives. In breaking bread together and sharing stories, in opening our hearts and hands, we are filled with God's love. And that is enough love to share with all who we encounter on this road of life. Amen.